What if I told you that one of the most powerful financial institutions in the world doesn't operate out of Wall Street, doesn't hold flashy investor conferences, and doesn't even publicly disclose most of its balance sheet, yet it controls tens of billions of dollars in assets? It owns massive stretches of farmland across multiple countries. It holds premium commercial real estate in global cities. It manages investment portfolios that rival major hedge funds. And it operates with a level of discipline that many corporations can only dream of. This isn't a bank. This isn't a sovereign wealth fund. This is a church. The Mormon Church, officially called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, has quietly built one of the largest institutional financial empires on earth. But here's the mystery. How did a religious movement born in poverty, persecution, and forced migration evolve into a global business powerhouse? Was this transformation accidental? Or was it engineered slowly, strategically, and deliberately over generations? To understand the answer, we need to rewind nearly 2 centuries, to a time when there was no empire, no investment portfolio, and no billion-dollar balance sheet. Only belief. The Mormon Church was founded in the 1830s by Joseph Smith, in a young America still struggling to define its identity. This was a chaotic era: economic depressions, westward expansion, political instability, and religious revival movements all colliding at once. Smith didn't begin with money or political power. He began with followers who were largely poor farmers, laborers, and settlers. From the very beginning, Mormon communities faced extreme hostility. They were driven out of towns, attacked by mobs, and forced to migrate repeatedly from New York to Ohio, then Missouri, then Illinois. Eventually, after Smith's death, leadership passed to Brigham Young, who led tens of thousands of followers westward into the harsh deserts of what would become Utah. This was not wealth building. This was survival. But survival forged something more powerful than money: organizational discipline. Mormon settlements were tightly coordinated. Land was allocated centrally. Resources were pooled. Labor was shared. Infrastructure was built collectively. And most importantly, the church established a formal financial system that would later become the engine of its empire. That system was tithing. Tithing wasn't just encouraged, it was institutionalized. Members were taught that giving 10% of their income to the church was a spiritual obligation tied to blessings, temple access, and religious standing. Unlike many religious donations that fluctuate wildly, this created something rare: predictable, recurring revenue. As membership grew, so did cash flow. But here's where the story takes a critical turn. Instead of spending everything immediately on buildings and operations, church leadership adopted a strategy few religious organizations ever implement. They saved aggressively. They invested patiently. They reinvested returns. Over time, tithing became more than donations. It became capital. Capital that could acquire land. Capital that could build businesses. Capital that could compound quietly in the background. And by the early 20th century, the church had already begun building what looked less like a religious treasury and more like a long-term investment fund. Unlike flashy corporations, the Mormon Church didn't chase headlines. It chased assets. The early focus was land. Why land? Because land produces food. Land holds value. Land can be leased, sold, developed, or held indefinitely. The church acquired massive agricultural operations, farms, ranches, cattle operations, and grain storage facilities across the western United States. But agriculture was only the beginning. As cities grew, the church expanded into commercial real estate, office buildings, shopping centers, media companies, insurance businesses, publishing operations, broadcasting networks. By structuring ownership through separate legal entities, subsidiaries, and holding organizations, the church created a corporate-style ecosystem that kept religious operations separate from business investments, at least on paper. To the public, the church still looked like a faith organization. Behind the scenes, it was becoming a diversified institutional investor. And then something else happened that accelerated everything: global expansion. After World War II, Mormon missionary efforts exploded worldwide. Membership expanded rapidly across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Every new member meant something powerful: another stream of tithing revenue. This created a feedback loop. More members gives more revenue, gives more investment. Capital gives stronger financial base, gives more ability to expand globally. Unlike companies that rely on consumer demand, the church relied on long-term commitment and cultural loyalty. This created remarkable financial stability. Economic recessions came and went. Market crashes happened, but the church's revenue base remained surprisingly resilient. Because when people tighten spending, they often don't stop religious obligations, and leadership continued reinvesting surplus funds. Which brings us to the moment where everything changed. The moment the church transitioned from conservative investing to industrial-scale wealth management. By the late 20th century, the Mormon Church was generating far more money than it needed for day-to-day operations. This created a strategic dilemma. Do you spend excess funds, or do you store and grow them? Leadership chose the second option. The church quietly created professional investment arms staffed with finance experts, portfolio managers, and institutional-level strategists. The most famous of these entities, later exposed by whistleblowers and journalists, managed tens of billions of dollars in stock market investments alone. These funds weren't sitting idle. They were invested across U.S. equities, international stocks, index funds, bonds, private equity-style assets. Compounding worked its magic, year after year, decade after decade, while members believed their donations funded local congregations and humanitarian aid. A significant portion was being preserved and grown untouched in massive investment portfolios. This revelation shocked the public when it finally surfaced. But for church leadership, it wasn't a scandal. It was risk management, a permanent financial reserve, a war chest designed to last generations. This system worked for three main reasons. First, centralized control. Decisions were made by a small leadership group, not millions of individual donors. Second, long-term thinking. There was no pressure to show quarterly profits. Third, cultural loyalty. Members contributed consistently, often for life. Put together, this created something incredibly rare, an institution with infinite time horizon. No shareholder revolts, no hostile takeovers, no short-term profit pressure, just steady accumulation. But this strategy carried consequences, and eventually, the secrecy became impossible to maintain. For decades, the Mormon Church's financial empire operated quietly, almost invisibly. No flashy earnings calls, no shareholder meetings, no public balance sheets showing the full picture. But in the late 2010s, that silence cracked. Whistleblowers stepped forward, internal documents leaked, investigative journalists began connecting dots that had never been connected before. Suddenly, the world learned that the church wasn't just financially stable. It was sitting on an investment portfolio worth tens of billions of dollars. To many outsiders, this revelation was shocking. But for lifelong members, it created something deeper than surprise. It created confusion. Because for years, members had been told that tithing funded missionary work, temple construction, education programs, and humanitarian aid. Now they were learning that massive portions of that money had been quietly accumulating in stock portfolios and reserve funds rarely touched, rarely discussed. The question wasn't just how much money do they have. The question became, why was it hidden? The church defended its strategy as responsible stewardship. Leadership argued that long-term reserves were necessary to protect the institution against future crises, economic collapses, wars, or global instability. And to be fair, this logic isn't irrational. Many universities, foundations, and non-profit institutions operate endowments designed to last forever. But the Mormon Church isn't just any non-profit. It asks members, many of whom are low income, to sacrifice 10% of their earnings as a spiritual requirement. That creates a moral tension, because when people give money believing it's being used for direct religious or humanitarian purposes, but instead it's quietly invested and rarely spent, the emotional contract changes. Some members felt proud of the church's financial success. Others felt betrayed. Attendance declined in some regions. Online forums filled with debates. Faith leaders faced difficult questions they weren't prepared to answer publicly, and governments began paying attention to. As scrutiny increased, financial regulators began examining how church investment entities were structured. Questions emerged about disclosure practices, tax treatment, shell organizations, reporting requirements. Because while religious institutions receive tax advantages, investment operations often operate under stricter financial rules. This created a gray zone. Where does religion end and institutional investing begin? The church made adjustments. Some structures were reformed. Reporting procedures were altered. But the fundamental strategy remained intact: long-term capital preservation, low spending rates, high reinvestment. The empire didn't collapse. It adapted, just like it always had. After the financial revelations, many expected full transparency to follow. It didn't. While some information became public, the full scope of church holdings remains largely unknown. Why? Because transparency creates pressure. Pressure to spend more. Pressure to justify accumulation. Pressure to explain why an organization dedicated to spiritual values holds more wealth than many governments. Instead of radical openness, the church opted for controlled disclosure. Enough to satisfy regulators, not enough to satisfy critics. This strategy mirrors something we've seen repeatedly throughout history. When institutions become large enough, they prioritize stability over trust. They protect systems over relationships. They choose insulation over vulnerability. Which brings us to the bigger pattern. The Mormon Church isn't alone. Across the world, we're seeing the same behavior repeated by mega universities with billion-dollar endowments, foundations holding massive untapped reserves, governments stockpiling sovereign wealth funds, corporations accumulating record cash piles. The logic is always the same. Uncertainty is rising. The future is unstable. So, institutions hoard resources. But here's the shocking pattern. The more wealth institutions accumulate, the less they actually spend proportionally. Endowments grow faster than aid budgets. Investment returns outpace charitable distributions. Capital compounds while social problems remain unsolved. This creates a paradox. Organizations built to serve people slowly begin serving their own financial survival first. And that's the uncomfortable question surrounding the Mormon Church today. Has the financial system become more important than the mission? When an institution holds enormous reserves, it gains something more powerful than profit: influence. With money comes political access, economic leverage, real estate control, media presence, cultural reach. The church can develop entire city blocks, purchase strategic land, build commercial hubs, influence local economies. This isn't corruption, it's structural power. And structural power reshapes institutions over time, because once money becomes central, every decision begins to revolve around protecting it. Risk is avoided, change slows, tradition becomes policy, and growth becomes the primary goal, not spiritually, but financially. The Mormon Church now stands at a crossroads. On one side, unprecedented financial security. On the other, growing public skepticism. Younger generations increasingly demand transparency. Digital culture makes secrecy harder to maintain. Faith institutions are being held to corporate-level accountability. The question isn't whether the church will remain wealthy. It will. The question is whether it can maintain moral authority while operating as a financial giant. Because once people see behind the curtain, they don't forget. The church didn't become wealthy overnight. It followed decades of consistent saving, reinvestment, centralized control, and long-term planning. This is the same model used by successful institutions everywhere. Money grows when systems outlast individuals. When money reaches a certain scale, it stops being a tool. It becomes the mission. Even organizations founded on spiritual or charitable goals are not immune to this shift. The bigger the reserves, the harder it becomes to let go. People don't just care about how much money exists. They care about honesty. Once transparency disappears, trust erodes, and rebuilding it is far harder than building wealth. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Every institution eventually faces the same test, not whether it can accumulate power, but whether it can resist becoming controlled by it. The Mormon Church built one of the most successful financial systems in religious history, but history shows us something else. Empires rarely fall because they're weak. They fall because they forget why they were built. If you found this breakdown eye-opening, hit the like button so this story reaches more people. Subscribe if you want more deep dives into hidden financial systems, institutional wealth, and how power really works behind the scenes. And most importantly, comment below. Do you think religious organizations should be allowed to accumulate massive financial empires, or should there be limits? Your perspective matters. Because the conversation about money and power is far from over.